Hello, my name is Chamberlain. I'm a senior lecturer on the drawing and print and the multidisciplinary printmaking program at UWE in Bristol. This presentation will cover a brief overview of my background and the effects of lockdown on my practice. Past examples of locations that I visited have included the Mountstall Seafort, the Thames Estuary, and also the acoustic sound mirrors. Now, a lot of the things I've referenced are man-made technologies or industrial structures. They were also at the cutting edge of technology for their time. But when I'm starting to look at these locations, it's vital that I actually visit the location and gain that first-hand experience. Now, obviously, with the lockdown, that's put that approach to an abrupt halt. But it's vital that I actually, I think, put across to you or show previous bodies of work to show where the thinking's come from. Now, the prints themselves are not just an architectural study, they're evidence of my own observations and responses to the subject through the interlinking processes of drawing and printmaking. Now, primarily etching is used in this case to actually realise the work. What etching offers me is a diversity of mark making and a depth of tone that helps capture form, volume, and the surface qualities of these objects. Now, each body of work feeds on the previous one, actually giving me a kind of a developing understanding of a technical approach, but also a conception underpinning. So there's an ongoing inquiry into process, concept, recording these structures in, and trying to show a deeper explanation of their historical, cultural, and social impact through the architectural remains of these man-made creations. Now, I think a good example to talk about this or in more depth is my latest body of work, the Atlantic Wall, which was supported by UWE and is a big focus of my ref output this year. For those of you that don't know, the Atlantic Wall was a system of coastal fortifications built by the Germans in the Second World War, and it covers a 6,000 mile stretch across the western coast of Europe from southern France up to the north of Norway. Now, the choice of the Atlantic Wall offers contemporary relevance and a symbolic connection with current social and political debates around the visible and invisible barriers that we come across, and also the UK's impending isolation from the continent. It also relates with Trump and his wall and this idea of defences and keeping people out and the fallacy that actually this can represent. Brexit is also a heavy part of this as well, and this sense of borders and boundaries, which will has actually informed work I'll talk about later on in lockdown. Now, within the Atlantic Wall itself, some of these visible barriers actually remain isolated architectural symbols, almost representing a permanence that's slipping into failure and decay. They're tilting, they're being swallowed, the ground is being taken away from underneath them. Eventually they will disappear. And I feel they're a visual metaphor of a shifting political, social, and environmental landscape. As I mentioned, it's vital that I actually visit these locations. So in this case, I was able to document it through drawing, some very quick ink wash studies, but also video and sound have informed the work heavily back in the studio later on. Now, there's no actual figure, human figure next to these objects, which I think gives an ambiguity of scale and helps give the work a sense of the monumental and the iconic. And it also shows, I feel, that as they're crumbling and disappearing, this idea of frailty and insignificance, as I said earlier, they will disappear. Now, what happened in this body of work was quite a turning point for me in the fact that by actually seeing the bunkers firsthand and up close, you could see the wooden textures of the formers pushed into the concrete that was still evident today, so they were actually printed. So I wanted to bring that back into the work. I love the idea of, very excited about the idea that the subject matter itself was dictating the materials being used to record it. So I started pushing these wooden textures into the wax ground and incorporating that as part of the work. And this is an example of a finished piece on that one. So I created several pieces around this project, and they will be shown at an exhibition later on this year, which I'll give you details of at the end of the talk. Now, just before lockdown, and this is what led on to a lot of the work in that period, I was working with a photographer, Tim Pearce, and together we were incorporating the use of wet plate collodion processes to actually photograph some of the digital photographs I'd already taken. But it was the idea of using this kind of highly traditional approach that was also used to explore the Western frontiers in America. And that's something that's come back into the work, this idea of paying homage to traditional processes, but reinventing them within a contemporary context. So it's the idea of using wet plate collodion to almost, I suppose, celebrate the glitch, celebrate the mistakes, and record that back through drawing and the printmaking program. So just before the lockdown, I was able to work with Tim on this, and it's something we're going to build on over the future. But I got very excited about this idea of slowing things down, this photographic, this drawing, blurring the lines between the photographic printed and the drawn elements. So they were originally drawn, taken through that process, and then incorporated into the etching process as well, changing that level of density, quality of mark making, and almost giving it a new existence. Then I started to actually use, because they were exposed onto glass plates, I started to layer and collage these plates, scanning them through, almost increasing or exaggerating the mistakes and the layering with them. So I started to play around with those, and again I was using those to slow down and draw. And this became vital for the lockdown work, because what I started to do was appreciate actually how the original drawn works could work independently, and actually the prints can be an extension of that and give the work a new life. Also, just before a lot happened before the lockdown period, but I started to work with Frank Menger and Neve Fahy in the Centre for Fine Print Research at UWE. And I've been working with CFPR on and off over the last few years, but this body of work really gave us a focus to start getting our teeth into something more substantial. So we started wrapping the digital prints around a plinth and creating almost these mock monumental setups, and then using the wet plate collodion to take photographs of them. So they almost started to become these Greek ruins, which I think romanticize the objects and the subject matter. And I think this is quite an interesting development that I've been in discussion with Frank over the lockdown, and we will be developing this and using this in the future. So we actually get then to the lockdown period. Now, I didn't have any access to print facilities. I had to take a step back, and I had to focus differently. So I took a step back and started actually reading a lot more than I do usually. And I talked to my students a lot about this, about the idea of taking a broader range of references in your work and to continually keep an eye on the contemporary relevance of the work and what you're saying. So I've shown an example here of some of the books I was reading during this time. Some are more theoretical, some deal with narrative, but they all deal with place and memory and architectural forms. So it was a really good opportunity, I think, to make myself a more rounded practitioner. It's also accepting the use of music and how I use music, whether to listen to inspire. But something I won't go into more depth here, but I'm working with a composer as well. We've been in communication over the lockdown, and we will be developing soundscapes to go along with some of this work in the future. And I'm really, really excited of where that can go. And it was part of an Arts Council bid, which I put forward just after Christmas. So I hope to build on that. And with the help of RBI, I will be building up, hopefully, new approaches for this kind of visual, this linking or this combination of visual and sound elements. So the work I did during the lockdown period dealt with shelters, man-made shelters. And it draws upon my previous architectural influences and conceptual references. But with no access to print, I concentrated purely on the drawing. And not being able to travel, I almost travelled through the through the use of Google and the immediacy the images gave to me. So again, I would though collage, change these images and make them my own. But really it was Google that became that starting point. And the theme really running through the work was the idea of shelters, frontiers, outposts and boundaries. So I hope you can see there the correlation or the link with the previous work that I was talking about. But these have been deeper informed by other texts. So an example of those are the Ozymandias poem by Percy Shelley, Invisible Cities by Calvino, which I showed earlier, and the Terminal Beach short story by J.G. Ballard. All these things start to resonate in the work and feed it in some way. Now, concentrating on this a simpler focus of shelter, and really looking at man's or human's basic need for shelter. So although I've been looking at high-end technologies for some of the, from the military or from industry, actually looking at a simpler focus of just shelter and that need for protection was actually quite liberating. And they're also isolated in their composition, their placements on the page. Some of the structures are half built, some are in the process of being built, and I feel this skeleton and framework almost heighten this sense of vulnerability and openness to the elements. The shift of scale also changed. A lot of my etchings are traditionally are quite big for the traditional size of etchings. So actually working in these smaller sheet, and all these drawings, well, each drawing would fit within an A4 page. So it's almost as if the work itself has become transportable and could easily be folded away or packed away and taken with you. So actually it was a quicker, faster way of realizing things. An etching would take me 2 to 3 months. These drawings would take a day or two to complete. So it was actually quite liberating in that way. Although now I finished it, I'm actually really interested in getting these into print and maybe photogravure or maybe even some dry points in some way. But it really has, I think, this period opened my eyes or broadened the possibilities in my work and establishing a greater dialogue between drawing, print, and photography. And I think I'm really excited about where this can go over the next few years. Okay, so just to wrap up there, what you will be able to do, I'll be exhibiting these or some of this work over the next couple of months. In October, there's a Centre of Gravity in October in Bristol, where I'll have some of these drawings blown up and digitized and actually attached to the fabric of a building that's about to be demolished, and turned into flats. So it's the idea that that these images will be lost, they're temporary, and I quite like that idea because it links very well with the idea of a temporary structure. These weren't built to last; they could be taken apart and moved. And the big show I have at the Rabley Gallery in November is my Atlantic Wall project, and I will be publicising that through the university nearer the time. But that is an accumulation of 3 to 4 years of the Atlantic Wall work, and there'll be 20 to 30 drawings and etchings shown within that. So I hope the presentation has given some insight into my background, into my interests, but also how the lockdown period, if I look back on it, actually has opened up more possibilities than I thought possible at the beginning. Okay, thank you.